Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Seblewongel Asrat. I am a director at the Immunology and Inflammation department at Regeneron. And this is the Nucleus by Regeneron, a podcast where we talk about science that intrigues and fascinates us. Today's guest is Dr. Brian Kim. He's a professor of dermatology and vice chair of research at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
So you spend a lot of time thinking about itch, and chronic itch is something that has a profound impact on patients' lives. But I don't think it's still well appreciated the extent of that impact. And also the biology of itch may not be as obvious to everyone. Can you tell us a little bit about your work on itch and the impact that actually has on patient lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think itch has been overlooked for a lot of reasons because people view it as a symptom. So when I first started studying itch, a lot of people actually dissuaded me from it. They said, why don't you try to cure cancer or something else, right?
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's not, you don't think of itch as being something that you need for survival or that it's a huge problem. If someone doesn't itch, it's not like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? It started that way. But I think at the end of the day, all of our science, by the way, was based in areas that were kind of on the fringes where people were saying, what exactly are you studying? Is it important? Some of the things we were studying were considered vestigial. And I think a lot of science is skewed towards if you don't need it to survive, then it's not important. But as a physician, where that really shifted is if that thing that you think is not important is turned on, like itch, and it terrorizes you, then it is really important, right? So, and I think that's a different way to look at biology. And that's how we kind of went about itch. And of course, it's very important. I view right now, we're much further along. There's so much more appreciation for it than 10 years ago. So I'm very encouraged at where we're at. But also the biology has come a long ways. And I like to think we contributed to that progress.
And you think we're far ahead because of all the biology that we're understanding, or is it because that there's so many treatment options now? Like, where do you think?
No, I think it's a little bit of all of the above.
Okay.
But if you really go back to where it started, I think it starts with biology.
Okay.
Right. So even at companies like Regeneron, it really starts with the biology. Is there something that's real that we can actually get at? And with itch, it really started with the discovery that there are pathways for itch that are very distinct and specific. Because up to that point, everyone said itch is just a mild form of pain.
Yep.
And they said, well, can't you just study pain? If we fund more pain research, won't we get to it? The simple answer was no. And there were other reasons. There was the opioids that were overutilized for pain. So there was also less incentive to really study other pathways as well. So that's kind of how we landed on itch is the itch pathways are starting to be discovered. And we just linked it to inflammation. And we said, if there are itch-specific pathways, there might be itch-specific pathways that are triggered by inflammation.
So when it comes to the patient perspective, I mean, what you described sounds incredibly, impactful. Do you have any moments in your career that you remember that, like a patient was relieved of itch and their life changed? And how was that for the patient? How was that for you?
Many moments. I've had so many moments like that. I mean, I see patients that have failed so many therapies, seen many dermatologists throughout the country. Patients fly in, and we've had lots of crazy stories where people have been itching for 20 years and they finally felt better. 10 years felt better, and then we would try new therapies and they would feel better sometimes within 30 minutes.
Wow.
So just take that time dimension. You've been suffering for something every day for 20 years, and in a matter of 30 minutes the symptom or feeling goes away that's been terrorizing you. It's a really dramatic moment for the patient. It's very dramatic for me. And I think what actually strikes me most now is how much we already take it for granted. These patients will come, both the patient and I, right? Patients will come in and we'll put them on a drug and the itch gets better within hours. And they go, thank you. And I'm thinking, you're welcome. And, and we're thinking, wow, 10 years ago, this was just suffering and 45 minutes in the clinic trying to talk through, what we can and can't do. We'll try this, maybe we can try this and that. And we've come an incredibly long ways.
So do you see common triggers of itch across? So I know for atopic dermatitis, there's a lot of, underlying type 2 inflammation that could be the driver. Is that the consensus across different type 2 driven inflammatory skin conditions and even outside of type 2 inflammatory diseases? Is that?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I think it's not that long ago, but in this field, it feels like a long time ago. I think around 2019, we were submitting a review article to the Journal of Immunology. And my graduate student said, I don't feel comfortable with this review article. And what we had written, we showed like a sensory nerve, and half of it showed these cytokines or inflammatory mediators associated with autoimmunity.
Yeah.
TNF, IL-6, even IL-17, IL-1 beta. And classically, it had been known that these cytokines are associated with pain. So on one half of the nerve, we showed these cytokines that are classical pro-inflammatory cytokines,
right.
The classical pro. And we showed that they cause pain. And then we were showing cytokines like IL-4,
yep.
IL-13, even like IL-33 at that time.
Yeah.
And we're saying itch.
Yeah.
But, this was very emergent. It was a lot of work coming from our lab. And my graduate student said, she's a timeout.
Yeah.
I'm uncomfortable. This is very provocative.
Yeah, I can.
And I said, yeah, it's provocative, but it's also where the data is pointing.
Yeah.
I don't know that itch is a pro-inflammatory phenomenon. It's more of an allergic or type 2 phenomenon. And we put it out there. And I also told her name's Anna Trier. And now she's in residency dermatology at Northwestern. And I said, Anna, sometimes you have to take a risk with ideas. And a review article is not data driven. It's based on concepts.
Yeah.
And we got to put it out there and frame it. And to this day now, it seems more true than it was even back then. And so many studies have proven that.
Yep.
And in reality, type 2 inflammation is a default for the barrier to the outside world.
Okay.
So whether it's your upper airway
in
rhinosinusitis or allergic rhinitis, or whether it's even in asthma in your lung, or eosinophilic esophagitis, which is the stratified squamous epithelium still, half of it or a third of it is. It's everything that's facing the outside world first, when breached, defaults to type 2 inflammation.
Interesting.
Right? Okay. So if I scratch myself, I'll get type 2 inflammation. And one of the things that I think confused people about that for so long is that if type 2 inflammation just is a breach of the barrier, I think they didn't think of it that way. But I think they thought, well, is this really a disease? Even eczema or atopic dermatitis, there were some questions about whether it's really a disease. Because it seems like you could just scratch yourself to that.
Yeah.
They used to call it the itch that scratches, right? But I think at the end of the day, as I've said many times, that we're not really treating diseases, we're treating processes. And if we treat these processes that underlie diseases, then you can, on the way, solve these diseases, treat diseases, and maybe even cure these diseases. So type 2 is a process where we face the outside world, and when that's breached, we default to it. That's not true of other inflammatory axes. So Th1 or type 1 or Th17, you don't default to psoriasis. You don't default to alopecia areata. You don't default to vitiligo. You don't default to Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, or rheumatoid arthritis. Those are very distinct conditions that have other kinds of things that drive it. It's not barrier breach. It's not the breach of the outside world.
Very, very interesting. Actually, I want to use that as a segue to talk about atopic March. And I really like the idea of, like type 2 inflammation being this continuous inflammation that's happening. It's just manifesting in different organs. So can you tell us a little bit about this concept of atopic March and how itching can eventually lead to food allergies and asthma and EOE, as you described?
Yeah, so it's a good segue, because if you think about the atopic March, one of the unifying features of it is all at these barriers that face the outside world that when breached, default. I think the question is, how does the atopic March occur? So if we kind of walk through the atopic March, I have a daughter who's 6, has pretty bad atopic dermatitis. I'd say moderate to severe. I have a 5-month-old son now. He's developing atopic dermatitis already. And I'm worried it's going to follow hers in a lot of ways. And I'm watching these kids, my children, right? And I'm thinking, and other patients I've had their age, and I think, when are they going to develop asthma? When are they going to develop or are they going to develop food
Yeah.
allergy or peanut
Yeah.
allergy? We're worried about that. Or
Yeah.
things like eosinophilic esophagitis.
Yeah.
Is this going to happen?
Yeah.
Right. And that's an anxiety. And the question is, should we treat earlier? Intuitively, we think so.
Yeah.
And it's a thing we're actually trying to get my daughter to go on medicines to halt this. Right. And the atopic march, really, we know if you get sensitized to allergens over time, now at these other barriers, you're more susceptible to those allergens. But I don't think that early event, the way, say, my son is developing atopic dermatitis, I don't think that's an allergic reaction by any stretch. I don't think it's even an environmental thing per se, where there's an allergen. There's a kind of a hardwired susceptibility, and that's why this is clustering in my family. I suspect they got it from my side. And now that they have defective barriers, now they're getting sensitized to things in the environment. All right. And then now they're developing allergy, which is more of a hypersensitivity. And now the kind of anxiety is this going to spread to the lung or the upper airway, or what's going to happen? And I think what we're trying to figure out is what all are the processes that lead to this kind of, multiple organ disease phenomenon.
Very interesting. And what do you think would be like an ideal way to break the cycle? Is it healing the barrier early on, as you're describing, or is it, now I think the guideline is to start introducing foods early. Has that actually even had an impact? Like, what do you think actually makes a huge impact when it comes to this atopic march?
I think there's so many steps in the cycle, right? So there's barrier breach, which defaults to type 2 inflammation. In the skin, it's the initial event. But there's really no real barrier breach in the airway, or even the gastrointestinal tract later, or the upper lower airways, right? There's no real breach there, but they're sensitized. So that type 2 inflammation sets up now for a milieu to now sensitize. And then now that sensitization immunologically allows for now sensitivity, in my view, even in the absence of real barrier breach now. And now you get a little bit of sensitized hypersensitive reactions. And then now the barrier starts to breach from the inside out, right? And then I think this sets you up for more problems along the way. And I think really, inflammation begets inflammation. If you don't take care of inflammation and you let it brew. And I think this is therapeutically where we run into a lot of problems. There's a lot of therapeutic hesitancy. Even in my family, my wife says, do we really need to start treating them right away with a biologic? And then you let it brew for a long time. And then one thing we know about inflammation in general, but especially type 2 inflammation, it likes to wiggle around things. So if you let it hang out, it's going to find a way to spread. It's going to find a way, or even if you block it, but not sufficiently, it starts to figure out ways around it. And sometimes, unfortunately, even if you do it sufficiently, it finds a way around it. And there's a lot we still don't know. It's really interesting because, we have patients that don't respond to therapies that are very broad, actually, in terms of anti-inflammatory mechanisms, and they still break through with what looks like type 2 inflammation. And I look at them and I think, I thought we mopped up every type 2 inflammatory axis I could think of, but they're still breaking through. So what's going on?
Do you have a sense of what's going on? Is it that now the inflammation is shifting away from type 2, or is it that dosing, maybe this is not saturated?
I think there's dosing. I think there's I think there are different compositions of type 2. So I don't think type 2 is an on-off switch. It's what's the array of type 2 that you get, and what's the composite outcome of that. So if you think of type 2 cytokines, at minimum you have IL-4 or 5-13. You can start to incorporate TSLP, IL-33, in my view, in the skin, even IL-18. So you start bringing those into the fold. And the thing I always say about type 2 inflammation is that it's like keys on a piano. You have the same keys. You might even have the same restricted number of keys in type 2 inflammation, but you can play a lot of different songs with it. And there might be songs that we haven't heard yet that are when they wiggle around these therapies.
So if we take atopic dermatitis, for example, so how should we think about it? Is it the type 2 inflammation is driving the disease and there are other factors like, I mean, you mentioned IL-18, it could be IL-22. Is that the right way to think about it? Or is it that, I guess, is it just type 2 inflammation alone that's driving everything and that's leading to the other cascade?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is we don't really know yet. It's
Okay.
amazing. We still don't quite know. But I think that no inflammation is as clean as we like to think or believe,
Okay.
right? So when we first said type 2 inflammation is kind of the sequence.
Yeah.
And another thing that I've often said is that itching and scratching is a behavioral extension of type 2 inflammation, right? And again, we said that years ago, and it was considered rather bold to conclude that. I don't think people argue with that anymore.
Yeah.
So then the rebuttal to that was they say, well, why do people with psoriasis itch then?
Yeah.
Or why do people with allergic contact dermatitis itch? These are Th17, Th1 phenomena. Why do they itch? Well, every time we've dug into this, even embedded within the matrix of Th17, psoriasis or Th1, allergic contact dermatitis, is that there are type 2 mechanisms embedded in that that's still causing the itch. So if you have a mixture of inflammation and they press on different buttons, then the diseases become very complicated.
Yeah.
But in a way that's we can separate out. So in other words, if you're trying to treat itch in psoriasis, it may not be necessarily a Th17 thing or an axis that you're trying to block.
Right.
You're actually still going after type 2. So it's conceivable that if you're just treating itch and psoriasis, you're blocking type 2.
Yeah.
But also conversely, I think in atopic dermatitis, which we think of as a type 2 disease, there are other things that can kind of pile on.
Yeah.
We get staph infections all the time. That's not a type 2 provocation. That's very much a pro-inflammatory, classical pro-inflammatory. And those things complicate atopic dermatitis a lot.
Interesting. Where do you think the field is headed now? What have we done successfully and what do we need to do more successfully in the future?
Yeah, I mean, what we've done very successfully is we stopped a lot of allergic diseases and type 2 inflammation in many ways.
Okay.
Right? We've been able to mitigate and improve people's lives dramatically. There's no question about that. I think you and I can both say that we've been on that side of things. I think the question is, how do we now remit diseases?
Mm-hmm.
How do we prevent diseases?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have atopic dermatitis, can you prevent now the emergence of food allergy, asthma, allergic rhinitis, and all these other things that come downstream? Breaking the cycle early.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, it's the way I think of allergy is there's a aberrant reaction to the outside world or perception of the outside world. And to me, that's, if we can understand that interface, we can probably rewire how we respond to that in many ways. So I'm very, very hopeful, but I think there's ways to do it, and we could really develop new therapies, new platforms of therapy. So not the conventional ways we've thought about therapies.
That is fantastic. Is there anything that we haven't covered today that you would want to talk about in this podcast?
I think one of the things I would just say is that, in early medicine, we've always thought that the kind of holy grail was to make sure that people live longer.
Okay.
Right? Mortality was kind of the major emphasis. Actually, if you go back further in medicine, it wasn't even that. It was just making sure you can tell people when they're going to die. Yeah. That was considered being a great physician, right? And then we left through a therapeutic era where we said, if we could extend life, and we see that with cancer and all that, we've done that. But I think where we're living through now, what we're talking about is if you can improve the quality of life as people live longer, or not even, right? Even in having a great childhood free of allergic diseases is
that would be
huge.
That would be huge.
And so I think that what we previously considered inconveniences or just, it's too bad that you have eczema or itch, is we're now realizing these are very important things and could really change people's lives. And I think that's what we're living through, and that's the near future of medicine. What are you most excited about? I'm most excited about, really just changing completely the face of human disease in a short amount of time. And I think we're living through a renaissance. The science was always there,
Yep.
but now the technology is there. And we have
That is a great
technologies,
point.
the engineering,
Yep.
AI, we have ways to close the gap. And I think one of the things someone said to me recently is what we learned from COVID is this phenomenon of compression. Everything is compressed. We can move things very quickly. We can change how we do things very quickly. And I think that that's what we're living through in a very positive way now.
Fantastic. I hear you on tech. I mean, here at Regeneron, we're incredibly passionate about what's coming, and we have a genetic center that, we've been identifying specific genetic variants that have allowed us to understand key drivers of disease, and we're trying to utilize them to, better treat different diseases.
Yeah, well, that's the legacy of Regeneron,
Yep.
is you use technology to move forward faster.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what we're talking about on our end too.
I saw that you have a handle that I absolutely love, the Itch Doctor. How did you come up with that? That is a fantastic tag.
Yeah, people tell me it's really sticky. I
is,
just
yeah.
I didn't want it to be too sciencey. I said, I just want to be the doctor that treats itch. So that's how I came up with it. And it stuck. And yeah, that's what my email is also Itch Doctor.
Oh, really?
Well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The Mount Sinai email.
Yep.
Wow, fantastic. It was great to have you today, and it was very nice to show you around our labs and genetic center as well.
Yeah, I'm having a blast. I'm super excited to see the VelocImmune technology. I'm going to really geek out.
Same, always. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Brian Kim. It was an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a lot of fun.
This is the Nucleus podcast by Regeneron, and thank you. We'll see you at the next episode.